Hey there folks, it's the Southern Astrologer here with your... Wait a minute, we're not at the Southern Astrologer's house. We're actually over here in Nadiya Shah's house. And I think it's a good time for us to talk about the Houses of Astrology. Well folks, I want to let you know a little bit of how I'm going to structure this conversation, or this little bit of a chit chat we've got going on here. And how we're going to structure it is, I'm going to take you on a journey, and that journey is going to be about the self. And I'm going to need you to kind of listen up and put yourself in the self's shoes. So basically, we're going to be talking about you. So to kind of start out and what the self is going to be doing, well, the self is kind of on this road of discovery through all of these different houses. And much like a relay race, well, something has to be handed off from one house in order to get to the next house. And so that's how we're going to go ahead and structure this. So I would hope that you would keep that in mind as we kind of go through this journey together. Now we're going to go ahead and start out with the first house. Well, as I'd previously mentioned, the first house is, or maybe I didn't mention it, I don't know. It's kind of like all a little jumbled up in my head sometimes. But we're going to go ahead and start out with that first house. And that first house, well, that's what we call the house of self. And sometimes folks get a little bit confused about what that word self means. I mean, it's kind of esoteric and existential in certain cases, and it's pretty much somewhere between the unconscious and the conscious, or the conscious and the unconscious. Who knows? Well, I sometimes kind of look at it as like a self on a shelf. And sometimes we put that self on a shelf and we kind of forget about it. So I want to go ahead and let you know that the first house is the house of self, and that means it's you. Now, from that first house, we're going to navigate on over to that second house. And that second house, well, that's the house of values. And a lot of folks like to equate values with the possessions that you have. And these possessions are usually the things that you earn with money. Now, I guess that makes a whole lot of sense because there's been a whole lot of songs written about money. I mean, take for example, Pink Floyd wrote about money. And those boys over there in the pet shop, well, they also talked about let's make lots of money. And we can't forget about the Bigpoppa, who said that, well, mo money, mo problems. Now, when I start to look at this house and all these songs that have been written about money and value and all of those things, I kind of had to reconsider, and I said, well, my values can't be accompanied with problems. So I've decided to look at that second house as house of worthiness. So what's worthy to who? The self. Or what's worthy to you? Now, you're going to have to remember this as you navigate on over to that third house. And that third house is what we call the house of communication. Now, sometimes you kind of look at it and you're like, well, who exactly am I communicating with in this house? Well, oftentimes you are communicating with other selves on shelves. And they kind of look a whole lot like you. So that would equate to it kind of being like your brethren. What you know that once you get into this house of communication is that there's a whole lot of talking going on. And maybe not everybody knows exactly what they're talking about, but there sure is a whole lot of wind that's being spoken. So you're going to have to remember these types of things, because when you move on over to the fourth house, the things that you've learned in the third house are going to impact that fourth house. And that fourth house is what we call the house of home. Now, the house of home is really where we take care of those things that we love, and also those things that we found worthy. And some of those selves on shelves back in that third house of communication probably gave you some kind of indication of how you needed to take care of whatever it was that you found worthy of taking care of. So that's also going to be very important, because you may have been taking care of a diamond, and a diamond is going to need something a little bit different because it can stand the test of time, so it may not need as much care and nurturing. However, if it's a Fabergé egg that you found, well, those things are awfully fragile, and it's going to take a little bit more nurturing and caring. Now, there are occasions when you have found you an Easter egg, and you maybe want to be a little bit careful with those Easter eggs because they may not be exactly what it is that you're looking for and what you really want to take care of. And the reason why I say all of this is because this is going to be very, very important when you move on over to that next house, and that next house is the 5th house. Now, this 5th house is what we like to call the house of creativity. Some say the house of passion. So what we know is that whatever you've been taking care of in that 4th house, you're probably going to take it over into the 5th house. And if you have brought it this far, then it is probably something that's pretty dang important to you, and you probably ought to do something with it. So in this house of creativity and passion, well, sometimes that can be relationships, or some maybe an Easter egg that maybe you ought to get rid of. But you're going to try and make it be whatever it possibly can be, and that's a good thing. Because it is showing how much attention you're going to place on something that you're passionate about and makes you feel inspired and creative. Now, that's going to be very important when you move on over to the 6th house, because if, for example, you have painted yourself the next self-portrait, you want to make sure that you've got your ears when you get to that 6th house. And that 6th house, well, that is the house of health and daily routines. Now, what you're going to find when you get in this house is you're going to find a whole lot of information. There's going to be some information that you may not know what to do with, but that information is going to be gathered in that 6th house of daily routines and health. So it's going to be important that you listen up and that you think about what's going on in that 6th house, because that is going to be very, very important when we get to some of these later houses on down the road. Now, we're going to go ahead and take the information that we do know, and we're going to move on over to this 7th house. Now, everybody loves to talk about the 7th house. And why do they love to talk about the 7th house? Because, well, this is the house of relationships. And most of us traditionally think about the house of relationships as being all about one-on-one relationships and love and marriage and all of those things. But there's also relationships with others around you that are impacted in this particular house. Now, one relationship that oftentimes gets forgotten when you are in the 7th house is the one relationship that you will see when you look to the left. Now, what do you see when you look to the left? More than likely, when you're in the 7th house, what you're going to look to and see the left, at the left of you, is going to be that self on a shelf. You know, that one that's in the house of self, the one that's you. Well, it's very important when you see that, because you're asking yourself, what the heck are you doing all the way over there? Why aren't you here with me? And that's when we start to make some decisions and we start to make some choices, because you're going to either figure out whether or not you're going to abandon that self on the shelf, or whether or not you're going to figure out how to go and get it. Now, when you do that, it's very important, because that 7th house is not supposed to be a self-sacrificing house. So when you move on over to that 8th house, well, it's going to be very important to know what you're going to do. So when you move over to that 8th house, well, that's a house that kind of scares some folks, because you've had a lot of folks that say that's the house where you take a dirt nap. And ain't nobody trying to die anytime soon. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the house of rebirth, because that is where you get the opportunity to reconfigure some things. So if you got you an Easter egg and you took that Easter egg with you, well, you can go ahead and get rid of that Easter egg in this particular house. And if there are some things that you learned that you just no longer serve your purpose, then you can also get rid of this. And the great thing about this 8th house is that it has a nice little vantage point over to that 2nd house. Remember that 2nd house, that house of values, where we were talking about money and values and worthiness? Well, you get a really good idea here in this 8th house to kind of discard anything that's not worthy of your time, level, and effort. And that's going to be real important when you move over to the next house, because you can't take too much baggage when you move over to this 9th house. Now, this 9th house is what we like to call the house of travel and higher education. Now, in this house, it's very, very interesting because you might travel to a certain thing. You might figure out that you want to go a different course and that you want to learn some different things. And you can find yourself at some of the best libraries, looking at some of the finest of connoisseur types of text. And also what you'll find there are some shelves on shelves. And so it's very interesting because this ninth house, well, it gives you a really dang good vantage point over to that third house where, remember, you saw some shelves on shelves that were really just talking but not truly understanding. Well, this ninth house is going to give you the opportunity to look at different types of shelves on shelves and to understand rather than just listen. So that's going to be extremely important when you move on over to this next house, because what you learn in your travels is going to be very important when you start to set up how you want to show up in the world. Now, when we get to this 10th house, which is the house of career and aspirations and basically how you want to show up in the world, well, it's going to be really important because there is a bit of a spotlight on you, meaning that everything that you have learned thus far is really going to be put up for public consumption and for display. And because that 10th house sits right across from that 4th house, and I know we talked about the house of home, but there's one thing that's really residing in that house of home, and I hope you took care of it. I hope it was the diamond that you took care of, because that thing that's actually going to be taking a good look at you in the 10th house, well, and that resides in that 4th house, well, that's your soul. Okay, so home, this is also home right here. It's not just your brick and mortar home, it's this home right here. So what's actually going to be, and who actually is going to be taking a good hard look at you when you show up in the light that you really want to be in? Well, it's going to be your soul. So I hope that you show up with the best of intentions. Now, that's also going to be important because when you move on over to this next house, the 11th house, which is the house of community, hopefully you'll find some folks over there that have the same types of passions that you do, that are kindred spirits. Now, you might find some not so friendlies over there as well, but for the most part, you're going there because you have learned some things and you want to share that with the community. And so, because that is the community sector, together you're going to figure out how to do the things that you need to do when you need to do it, and you'll figure out whether or not you're really passionate about what it is that you've recently learned and what you've learned and what you know about yourself. Now, again, very important, not only about what you've learned about yourself, but what those folks have learned about themselves, because in the 11th house, not only are you being inspired, you're also inspiring others. So you're going to inspire each other as a community together. And when you guys do that, what happens is that you're going to have enough information to move on over to this next house. And, well, it looks like we've arrived at that next house, and that is the last house. That is the 12th house. And this is what some folks call the house of secrets or the house of self-undoing. I like to call it the house of self-undoing. And as with any journey, you ask, well, what am I undoing? What part am I undoing? I don't know. Well, I think it's important to really think about that, the fact that, in my opinion, that this is where the unconscious becomes conscious or the conscious becomes conscious, right? You're very much aware of what has transpired. You realize that you are somewhere. And so when you get to this last and final house, what ends up happening is that if you hadn't figured certain things out, or you've been carrying a little bit of extra baggage or a little extra load, well, this is probably the house where you can go ahead and get rid of some things. It's kind of like dropping things that you don't use at the Goodwill. Now, this 12th house of Goodwill is basically there because you need to, one, drop off some things that you're not using. And remember, I talked about that 6th house, because the 12th house sits across the street from the 6th house. And so remember, I told you that there was some information that you were going to be gathering, right? And you were going to be looking at what was healthy. And so now that you're in the 12th house, you got a pretty good idea of what's healthy and what's not. So what's not healthy for you, you can go ahead and leave it at this 12th house goodwill. And because there might be some other folks that could actually use what it is that you're not using, because it could quite possibly help them get to where they need to go. And also, you're going to need to unload some things, because you're not finished yet. That even though there's no more houses, there's still one house that you still need to visit. And you need to visit that house. If you can guess, go ahead and guess. If you guessed the 1st house, you'd be right. Now, why are you going back to that 1st house? Well, you're going back to that 1st house because remember, when you were over there in that 7th house, you looked to the left, and what'd you see? You saw that shelf on a shelf. And this entire time, you've been trying to get back to that 1st house so that you can go ahead and collect the thing that's really worthy of your attention. Now, folks, I know that was a whole ring around the rosy, and what I want to say is that although there's 12 houses, you're going to visit and revisit these houses over and over and over again until you find all pieces of yourself. So there's no more of leaving yourself on a shelf. You're going to go ahead and carry that along with you, and you're going to learn more and more, and you'll be happier. Well, I need to go ahead and get going before Nadiya returns and realizes that I've been shuffling some things over in her house. And so I sure do appreciate you hanging out with me for this chit chat. And what I like to say over in my neck of the woods is, do me a favor, try to not step in no cock-a-doodle-doo-doo, because that stench is sure hard to get off your feet.